The most important tool in a minefield is a stick. 30 centimeters of non-magnetic fiberglass, sharpened at one end, and you push it into the dirt at a 30-degree angle, every 2 centimeters, on your belly, for hours. Not straight down. 30 degrees, because a pressure plate wants weight from above, and a prodder coming in sideways will touch the casing before it touches the trigger. That stick is the only thing on Earth that turns unknown ground into known ground. Here is the part almost nobody outside the trade understands. Cleared land does not exist. There is no such thing. There is only proofed land, which means a human being physically put that stick into every square centimeter of it and signed a book saying so. A minefield map is not a map of where the mines are. It is a map of where somebody claims to have looked. Which means the most dangerous object in that valley was never a mine. It was a signature. I'm Nathan. Today I want to walk you through what happens when a man signs for ground he never walked, and then has to stand next to the person who can prove it. There is a moment in this one where a 14-year-old girl with a radio license knows more about a war crime than the entire chain of command above her father, and she knows it because he taught her to write things down. Stay with me. The stick comes back at the end. Abram Brannon learned soil before he learned anything else worth knowing. His grandfather drilled water wells across 4 counties in southern Missouri, and from the time Abram was 7, he rode in the passenger seat of a truck that smelled like diesel and wet clay. Holding a clipboard he was not allowed to write on until he could keep the columns straight. The old man had one rule that outlived him by 30 years. You do not tell a customer what is under his field. You tell him what you have proven is under his field, and only one of those is honest. Abram carried that into the army at 19, and it made him strange there, in a good way. He became a combat engineer, then a mine survey non-commissioned officer, and by 39, he was a staff sergeant with a reputation that traveled ahead of him. Brannon is slow. Brannon will hold up a whole company over a discrepancy of 6 meters. Brannon writes everything down. The writing everything down was the part that mattered. He kept what the trade calls a lane book, a green field notebook, ruled, sewn binding, and in it went every meter of ground he personally proofed, with the date, the soil condition, the depth of the prod, the names of the 2 soldiers who backed him, and his initials. Not a computer file, a book. He had 11 of them in a footlocker at home, and if you asked him why he did not use the tablet the army had issued him, he would say that a tablet remembers what somebody typed, and a book remembers what somebody's hand was doing at 4 in the morning. He met Marielle Elwood at the Pryor Landing County Fair when he was 24, and he did not know for 2 more months that the Elwoods owned about 1/3 of what he was standing on. The Elwoods were the kind of old rural money that does not look like money. Rosalind Elwood, the matriarch, drove a 15-year-old sedan and wore the same brown coat for a decade and controlled a company called Kestrel Clearance Group, which had started in the 70s blowing stumps and quarry faces and had grown, through 3 wars and a great deal of patient handshaking, into a mid-tier contractor doing unexploded ordnance removal on foreign aid money. Rosalind understood something early that most people in that business learn too late. The money is not in the danger. The money is in the paperwork that says the danger is gone. She never liked Abram, and the reason was never once spoken aloud. He was the only person at her dinner table who knew exactly what her company sold, how it was measured, and how easy it would be to lie about. They had one daughter, Adley, born the year Abram made sergeant, and she came out of the womb watching. Other babies cried at a room. Adley studied it. By 4, she could tell when adults were about to argue by the way they set down their cups. By 9, she had learned to be quiet in a house where being quiet was a survival trait. And that was the year her father, home for 11 days between rotations, took her 3 doors down to Elowin Pepper's back porch and changed the shape of her life. Elowin Pepper was 71, a retired air traffic controller, with hands that shook slightly and a voice that did not, and behind her house stood a 40-foot tower and a shack full of radios older than Abram. 26 years in a dark room in Kansas City, talking airplanes down through weather, had left her with 2 convictions she repeated like scripture. The air belongs to everybody, and if you did not write it in the log, it did not happen. Adley Brannon got her technician license at 10 and her general at 12, and by 14 she could work a pile-up on 20 meters better than men who had been licensed since before her mother was born. She had a paper logbook because Elowen made her start with paper, and she never stopped, and every contact went in it. Date, time and coordinated universal time, frequency, signal report, and a small column on the right that Elowen had ruled in by hand and labeled remarks. That column is the reason this story has an ending. The sked started as a way for a father to talk to his kid from the other side of the planet without the army in the middle of it. Sunday, 0300 Zulu, on a frequency Abram picked because it was ugly and unfashionable, and nobody else wanted it. He would get to a friend's rig at the task force headquarters, and she would climb Elowen's steps in her pajamas with a thermos of cocoa, and for 20 minutes the Brannons would run what they called the numbers game. He read her strings of digits, she read them back and logged them. It was, on its face, a father teaching a child to copy accurately under bad conditions, which is a real skill and a hard one. She thought it was practice. For 6 years it was practice. Adley was 11 when Sheridan Elwood came home in a uniform. Her uncle was 22 then, Marielle's younger brother, the only son, pushed through a state school officer program on the family's insistence, and out the other end a second lieutenant. He was tall and easy and genuinely funny, and he was the sort of man who remembered the name of your dog. Everyone in Prior Landing liked Sheridan Elwood. Abram liked him too, at first, and even after he stopped, he could see clearly why other people did not. The trouble with Sheridan was not that he was cruel. It was that he had been raised inside a company whose entire product was acclaim, and he had absorbed, the way a child absorbs an accent, the idea that the claim and the thing were the same. When Sheridan said a job was done, he believed it was done, and the believing came first, and the doing was a formality other people handled. By 26, his mother had made him a vice president of Kestrel on paper, while he was still on active duty, which nobody looked at closely for years, and by 27, he had personally guaranteed a bridge loan against a bid bond for the largest contract the family had ever chased. The contract was in Sarmenia, in a stretch of high scrub along an old ceasefire line called the Colvan Corridor, and it was worth more than everything Kestrel had ever earned put together. The Colvan Corridor was the sort of place that makes engineers quiet. For 9 years in the 1990s, two armies had faced each other across 11 kilometers of dry valley, and both had solved the same problem the same cheap way. They seeded the ground, not with the neat, surveyed belts that treaties imagine, but the way it actually happens when a war is going badly, and the trucks arrive with pallets nobody logged. Blast mines with plastic bodies and no metal worth finding. Bounding fragmentation mines on tripwires that rotted and left the fuse cocked. Whole squares dosed twice by 2 units who never told each other. Then the war ended. The maps burned or were never drawn, and for 30 years the valley simply ate people. Shepherds, children, a road crew in 2011. The locals had a map that was not on paper. You did not go past the third stone wall, ever, and the good grazing on the far side belonged to the dead. Task Force Rowan was the American piece of a much larger effort to give that valley back. 2 engineer platoons, a survey section, an ordnance disposal team, a medical element, and the working dogs. The mission was to survey, proof, and hand over cleared land to Sarmenian farmers, square by square. Commercial clearance done by contractors, quality assurance done by soldiers. Kestrel Clearance Group had the commercial half, and in the spring of the second year, through a rotation of officers that nobody at the time thought twice about, First Lieutenant Sheridan Elwood arrived to take over 2nd Platoon. His brother-in-law was that platoon's senior mine survey non-commissioned officer. Abram went to Captain Sabina Fitzgerald about it within 4 hours of finding out. She was the company commander, 34, an engineer officer with a jaw like a closed drawer, and she listened to him lay it all out on her plywood desk without interrupting once. Then she told him what he already knew. Battalion had looked at it. The relationship had been disclosed. Elwood had no financial interest of record because the vice presidency had been papered over as unpaid and advisory. What she did not say, because she could not, was that she had written a memorandum recommending against the assignment and had been told, courteously, that the corridor was politically delicate and the Elwood name opened doors in the donor committee. Abram found that memorandum 2 years later, in a stack of exhibits, and sat down on the floor of a hallway when he read it. So he did the only thing he had ever known how to do. He wrote everything down. The platoon Abram inherited that spring had two people in it who would matter more than anyone could have guessed. The first was Sergeant Ondine Callis, the medic, whom everybody called Doc, which she hated and answered to anyway. She was 31, from Bakersfield, raising a 6-year-old boy on a monthly allotment and her mother's patience, and she was better at her job than the job required. Because the corridor was a humanitarian mission with international donors and a great deal of liability floating around it, every medic in Task Force Rowan wore a small body-worn camera clipped at the sternum and was required to record every treatment and every evacuation. It was a paperwork rule. Doc Callis wore it the way you wear a watch and forgot it was there, and that is exactly how it caught what it caught. The second was Corporal Tulane Hardy, who everybody called Tully, and his dog. Tully was 23 and had aged out of foster care in Ohio with a duffel bag and a bus ticket, and he had walked into a recruiting office because it was warm. He was quiet in a way people mistook for slowness for about a week, until they watched him work. He was a mine detection dog handler, a job that consists almost entirely of learning to shut up and believe an animal, and he was extraordinary at it. His dog was a Belgian Malinois named Dime, 61 pounds of brindle muscle with one ear that never fully stood up, named by her first handler for a habit of turning on one, mid-sprint, on a scent. Dime did not find metal. That is the thing people never understand about mine dogs. She found the smell of explosive vapor rising out of soil, which meant she could find a plastic mine that would laugh at a detector, and she could do it walking, at a pace no man with a prodder could ever match. Abram Brannon, who trusted almost nothing, trusted that dog. He also, within a month, did something that would eventually save his life, for a reason so ordinary he never thought about it again until it mattered. In the chow tent one evening, he watched Tully Hardy sit alone through mail call for the 4th time and realized the kid had no one. So he wrote to his daughter and asked her, as a favor, to write to a soldier who did not get letters. Adley was 12. Her first letter was 4 pages long and contained, among other things, a diagram of an antenna and a strong opinion about a book. Tully wrote back 11 pages. They wrote for 2 years. She signed her letters the kid with the antenna. He signed his the guy with the dog. He sent her a photograph of Dime, asleep on a cot with her head upside down, and Adley taped it inside the front cover of her logbook, where it stayed. Thanksgiving of that second year, Abram was home on leave and the whole Elwood family filled Rosalind's dining room, and Adley went down the back hallway to get a phone charger and heard her uncle on the porch. She was 14 by then, and she had spent her entire childhood learning that the useful information in a house is never delivered to you directly. So she stopped in the dark and she listened, and what she heard was Sheridan Elwood telling somebody that the exposure was fine, that the survey backlog was a cash flow problem and not a real problem, and that if the audit came early, they would simply certify the outstanding squares and reproof them quietly on the next rotation. Then he said a sentence she did not understand for 11 more months. He said, and Adley wrote it in her logbook that night in the remarks column, word for word, because she wrote everything down. Nobody walks that ground anyway, mother. The shepherds are all dead. She dated it. 23rd of November, 2241 local. She did not tell her father. She was 14, and he was going back in 9 days, and she had learned that you do not hand a man something heavy at an airport. She told herself she would say it at Christmas. Abram found the discrepancy himself in February, and he found it the way he found everything, by being slow. The mechanism was simple enough that he was ashamed of how long it took him. Commercial clearance in the corridor was paid by the proofed square meter, verified against daily clearance certificates. The contractor's team leader signed for the work. The platoon leader countersigned that the military quality assurance element had observed it. And then a percentage of squares, never all of them, never enough, got randomly rechecked by the survey section, which was Abram, with his stick and his book. In February, the survey section drew grid square Colvon 44 out of the random sample, and Abram walked it, and he came back to the tent and opened his lane book, and then opened the certificate file, and sat there for a long time with a cup of coffee going cold. The certificate said Colvan 44 had been proofed on the 11th of December by a Kestrel team of 9 in one day to a depth of 13 centimeters, 11,000 square meters. Abram had walked 40 meters of it that morning, and in that 40 meters he had found undisturbed soil crust. Not disturbed and settled, undisturbed. The thin, crazed, sun-baked skin that forms on that clay, that a prodder breaks like the top of a creme brulee, and that does not come back in 10 weeks. 9 men could not have put a stick into that ground in December and left it looking like that in February. Nobody could. So he did what a careful man does. He checked 11 more squares against their certificates over the next 5 weeks, on his own time, walking short transects at the edges and in the interiors where nobody would think to fake it. 11 of 11 certified. 4 of them, in his professional judgment, never touched by a human being. He photographed his lane book pages with a camera that had no network connection. He wrote a memorandum for record and did not submit it. And then, on a Sunday at 0300 Zulu, on an ugly frequency nobody else wanted, he played the numbers game with his daughter. He read her strings of digits for 18 minutes. Grid coordinates, dates, certificate numbers, depths. She read them back and logged them, the way she had 1,000 times, with the date and the time in UTC and her father's call sign. And in the remarks column she wrote what he told her to write, which was, "Dad work numbers. Keep." Adley Brannon asked him one question at the end, and it was the right one. She asked if he was in trouble. He told her the truth, in the way you tell a 14-year-old the truth. He said that he had found a mistake that some people would prefer stayed a mistake, and that he was going to hand it to his commander when the survey closed in April, and that until then it lived in 2 places, his book and her book. And then he said the thing that she would repeat, eventually, under oath, to a room with a flag in it. He said, if a record only exists in one place, it isn't a record, it's a rumor. She wrote that in the remarks column too. Abram confronted Sheridan Elwood on the 9th of March, outside the survey tent, at night, with the generators running so nobody would hear. He did it wrong, and he knew it even while he did it, because part of him still wanted the man his daughter called Uncle Sure to have an explanation. He laid out 4 squares. He did not mention the other 7. He asked, flatly, whether Kestrel had certified ground it had not proofed. Sheridan did not panic. That was the thing that finished it for Abram. A guilty man panics. A man who has already decided panics about a different thing. Sheridan asked, carefully, who else had seen the numbers? Not whether the numbers were right. Who else had seen them? Abram said his book was his book. Then Sheridan offered him a job. $210,000 a year, Director of Field Quality for Kestrel. A title that did not exist yet and would be created for him. He said it easily and with real affection, and put a hand on Abram's shoulder, and said Marielle deserved a house that wasn't rented, and Adley deserved a college fund, and that this was how families took care of each other. Abram told him he would be reporting it to Captain Fitzgerald when the survey window closed on the 14th of April. Sheridan Elwood was quiet for about 4 seconds. Then he said, still warm, that he understood, and that he had always admired that about him, and he walked back toward the tents. Later, in a courtroom, a prosecutor would ask Abram what he thought in that moment, and he would say that he thought he had won. That was the honest answer, and it cost him something to give it. He had not won. He had simply told a man exactly how many days he had. The task came down on the 2nd of April. A survey team from the donor oversight body wanted eyes on the eastern squares before the quarterly release, and 2nd Platoon would escort them, and the route ran along the shoulder of Colvan 44. Sheridan Elwood volunteered the platoon for it in the evening meeting, enthusiastically, and put the mission together himself, which he almost never did. Abram read the plan twice and did not like it. The lane they would use to move dismounted along the shoulder was a lane Kestrel had certified in December. One of the 4. He said the platoon should take the northern access road and accept the extra 90 minutes. Sheridan overruled him in front of everyone, pleasantly, on the grounds of the visiting delegation's schedule, and then he did the thing Abram would think about for the rest of his life. He put Abram on point. Not as a punishment, as a compliment. In front of the whole platoon, he said that if they were going to move fast through a marked lane, he wanted the best surveyor in the task force reading the pickets, and half a dozen men nodded, and Doc Callis wrote in her own notebook, because she also wrote things down, that the platoon leader had assigned the survey non-commissioned officer to lead the dismounted element. They stepped off at 0640 on the 3rd of April. 11 dismounted, 2 vehicles paralleling on the road, the oversight team of 3 in the middle, Tully, Hardy, and Dime at the back of the file, because dogs work best when they are not eating other people's dust. The lane was marked the way lanes are marked everywhere in the world. Red-topped pickets on the left, defining the uncleared side. White on the right, the proofed side. 1.5 meters of ground between them that 400 people had walked since December on the strength of a piece of paper. At 0752, 110 meters in, a picket lay on its side in the dirt, knocked over by a goat or the wind or nothing at all, and the file drifted 8 feet to the right to go around it. Abram called the halt. He was already turning to say that they would re-establish the marking before anybody moved another step. The mine that took the man behind him was a bounding fragmentation charge, 30 years old, on a tripwire that had rotted into the grass, and it did what those things are designed to do. It jumped 1 meter into the air and it opened. Specialist Novaline Brenner, 20 years old, 11 months in the platoon, died before she was fully on the ground. What follows is what the manuals call a mass casualty in a live belt, which is 5 words standing in for the worst experience available to a human being. The file broke. That is the honest word. Training says freeze, mark your position, and wait to be extracted along a proofed lane. Training is correct, and training loses to the animal in the spine roughly half the time. 4 soldiers went right, into the uncleared side, because right was away from the smoke. The interpreter ran 40 meters in a straight line and lived, which was luck and nothing else. Abram Brannon went the other way, toward Brenner, because that is what he was going to do from the moment he heard it, and he got 11 meters into ground no stick had ever touched. The second detonation was under a man named Cortlandt, 6 meters to Abram's left, and it was a blast mine, and it took Cortlandt's foot, and it threw a spray of casing and stone sideways. 2 fragments went into Abram Brannon's right hip. One of them broke the ilium and stayed there. The other opened the gluteal artery, which is a phrase that means a man has somewhere between 20 minutes and 2 hours, depending entirely on what happens next. He went down on his side in the open, in an uncleared field, 90 meters from the road, and could not move his right leg, and knew, with the clarity of a man who has spent 20 years thinking about exactly this, that he was now lying inside a problem that could only be solved by somebody walking a lane to him. What happened over the next 14 minutes is preserved better than almost any event in this story, because 2 of the people in that field were recording. Doc Callis got to Cortlandt first, because Cortlandt was closer to the road and screaming, and she got a tourniquet high and tight on him in under 40 seconds. Her camera, clipped at her sternum, recorded a wedge of dirt, her own hands, and every word spoken on the platoon net through the speaker at her shoulder. The net is where it happened. At 0758, Sheridan Elwood called a withdrawal to the vehicles. That was defensible. That was, arguably, correct. You do not feed more bodies into a live belt. At 0801, Abram Brannon transmitted his own position and his own status, and he did it in the flat, unhurried, absurdly professional voice that people in that field would describe for years afterward as the worst thing they had ever heard. He gave a grid. He gave the nature of the wound. He said he had a lane he could work, that he had his prodder, and that he needed 1 man and 40 minutes. At 0803, Doc Callis said on the net that she was going for him and asked for a marking party. At 0804, First Lieutenant Sheridan Elwood ordered her to stand fast. She argued. It is on the recording. She said a sentence with the word artery in it 3 times. And then Sheridan Elwood said the words that ended his life as he had planned it, and he said them because he believed the only recording device in that valley was inside a vehicle 200 meters away, and because he was 28 years old and standing in the worst morning of his life, and the thing inside him that had been waiting for 11 months got its hands on the microphone. He said to write him off. He said Brannon was already gone, and anybody who went out there was gone with him. And then, to Doc Callis, not on the net but 3 feet from her chest, and directly into a camera he did not know existed. He said that his sister would get the pension, and the kids, and that this was the cleanest anybody was going to get out of this, and he told her that if she took 1 step off the road, he would put her in front of a board so fast her boy would be in high school before she saw a paycheck. Then he drew his sidearm. He did not point it at her head, exactly, which is a distinction that his defense counsel would spend a great deal of time on, and that would help him not at all. He held it at his side, and he stepped in front of her, and he said, "One more time, stand fast." Doc Callis stood fast. She was 31, and she had a 6-year-old, and a lieutenant, with a pistol in his hand, was standing between her and a bleeding man, and she stood fast, and she carried that for 2 years like a stone in her boot. The platoon pulled back to the vehicles. The vehicles pulled back to the road junction. At 09:15, Sheridan Elwood reported 1 killed, 1 urgent surgical, and 1 missing, presumed killed, last seen departing the marked lane on his own initiative. On his own initiative, 90 meters away, in the grass, Staff Sergeant Abram Brannon heard the engines change pitch and go quiet, and understood that he was alone, and got out his stick. Here is what a man does when the world leaves. He packed the hip wound with the entire contents of his aid pouch, and then with a rolled sleeve, and got his belt around the top of his thigh, which did almost nothing because you cannot tourniquet a hip, and he lay on his left side in a field of mines with the sun coming up hot, and made a decision that was, by any reasonable measure, insane. He decided to clear a lane, to himself, from himself. He could barely move his right leg, but the road was 90 meters away on a bearing of 270, and the only difference between 90 meters of death and 90 meters of ground was a stick and a man willing to use it, and he had both. So Abram Brannon lay on his side and prodded. 30 degrees, 2 centimeter spacing, left to right across a 40-centimeter front, then drag himself forward the length of his own forearm, then do it again. He marked his cleared strip behind him with whatever he had, a torn strip of his sleeve, a wrapper, 3 spent casings, a bootlace, the plastic cap off a marker pen, because a lane you cannot see is not a lane, and because some stubborn engineer part of his brain refused to make an unmarked one even now. He found 2 mines in 5 hours, both plastic, both within 30 centimeters of the strip he was clearing. He marked them by pushing a picket of dry brush into the soil beside each one and moving around them, which added 11 meters to a route he did not have 11 meters of blood for. He made 6 meters in the first hour, 4 in the second, and then the arithmetic began to go wrong. By noon, the temperature in the valley floor was 39 degrees. By 2 in the afternoon, he had stopped sweating, which he noted with professional detachment as a bad sign. By 4, he was making a meter every 20 minutes and hallucinating a dog barking, and he checked twice, carefully, and there was no dog. He had a survival radio in his vest, the small emergency set every soldier in the corridor carried, and he had been transmitting on the guard frequency every 20 minutes since 8 in the morning, and nothing had come back. He did not know that a search element had been requested and denied twice on the grounds that the area was a live belt and the individual was assessed as killed in action, or that at 11:40 that morning, First Lieutenant Sheridan Elwood had personally briefed the operations officer that Brannon was gone. What he did know, because he had built it himself 6 years earlier out of nothing but a father's paranoia and a good idea, was that his survival radio had a second frequency written on a strip of tape inside the battery cover. Not a military frequency. A ham band, low, ugly, unfashionable, the one nobody wanted. He had given his daughter that number when she was 11 years old, and told her, mostly as a joke, that if he was ever lost and everything else was broken, that is where he would be. At 4:40 in the afternoon in the Colvan corridor, which was 0340 on Sunday morning Zulu, Abram Brannon rolled onto his back in an uncleared field with a broken hip and pushed his transmit button and read out, in a voice that barely worked, the only string of numbers that mattered. 8,000 miles away, a 14-year-old girl in pajamas was already sitting in a cold shack with a thermos, because it was Sunday, and because he had never missed a sked in 6 years, and because 40 hours earlier her mother had said something at the kitchen sink that had made every hair on Adley Brannon's arms stand up. Marielle Brannon had gotten the phone call on Friday. Not the official one. There was no official one yet, because there was no confirmation and no body, and the casualty notification system does not move on an officer's opinion. The call she got was from her brother, from a satellite phone, at 2 in the morning, and it lasted 19 minutes. Adley heard the end of it from the top of the stairs. She heard her mother crying, which was expected, and then she heard her mother say, in a voice that had already stopped crying and gotten organized, the word Friday, and then the word forms, and then a sentence about whether they should wait for the letter or start now. Then Marielle came out of the kitchen and said, gently, that her father had been in an accident, and that they had to be strong, and Adley Brannon, 14, standing on a staircase, asked her mother one question. She asked how she knew. Marielle said Uncle Sheridan had called. And Adley, who had spent 5 years writing down everything anybody said to her, felt the floor of her childhood quietly give way, because she had been in that hallway on the 23rd of November, and because 2 Sundays ago her father had read her 18 minutes of numbers and told her to keep them. She did not scream. She did not accuse anybody. She went upstairs and got her logbook. At 8 in the morning on Saturday, she walked 3 doors down to Elowen Pepper's kitchen and put the logbook on the table and said, I think my uncle killed my dad, and I think I can prove part of it, and I need help with the other part. Elowen Pepper was 71 years old and had talked 104 airplanes down through a line of thunderstorms in 1997 with a failing radar and no relief for 6 hours. She read the logbook for 11 minutes without saying anything. Then she asked one question, which was whether Adley had the frequency her father would use if everything else was broken, and Adley said yes. It's on page 1 of book 1. And Elowen said, all right, then we do 2 things at once. The first thing was the radio. They did not simply listen. Elowen Pepper had spent a career understanding that a single receiver is a rumor and a network is a fact, and she had a network, a couple of hundred licensed operators across 11 time zones who owed her favors or simply liked being useful at 3 in the morning. By Saturday afternoon, there were 19 stations from Missouri to Cyprus, listening on one ugly frequency for a signal that might not exist, all of them recording, because Elowen Pepper made everybody record. The second thing was the letter. Adley Brannon had a folder of letters from a corporal in Sarmenia who signed himself the guy with the dog. She did not have a phone number. What she had, because he had mentioned it once in a letter about how boring guard shifts were, was the name of the internet cafe tent at the base, and the fact that he checked messages on Saturdays after evening chow. And she had, from her father, a piece of advice she had never used. If you ever need to reach somebody on a base, and you are not the army, be boring, be specific, and be early. She wrote to Tully Hardy at 11 minutes past 9 on Saturday morning, and the message was 90 words long, and it did not say please or beg. It gave a grid coordinate from her father's numbers game, and the date and time of a discrepancy, and one sentence. My dad went into Colvin 44, and my uncle came back, and my uncle is the one who told my mom, and nobody has looked for him. Then she went back to the shack and sat down and put on the headphones and waited 18 hours. Corporal Tulane Hardy read that message at 19:20 local time on Saturday. He was 23. He had been told, along with everyone else, that Staff Sergeant Brannon had left the marked lane and was assessed killed in action, and he had believed it, because Abram Brannon leaving a lane made no sense at all, and that was exactly the shape of the guilt he was carrying, the idea that even Brannon had panicked. He read Adley's message 4 times. Then he went and found Doc Callis behind the aid station, sitting on an ammunition crate with a cigarette she was not smoking, and he said, quietly, that Brannon's kid had emailed him, and that she was asking whether anybody had looked. Doc Callis put her face in her hands and did not take it out for a long time. Then she told him, all of it, in 11 minutes, in a voice that kept stopping. The withdrawal order. The word artery said 3 times. The pistol at the lieutenant's side. Stand fast. And at the end of it she reached into her cargo pocket and took out a small plastic card and held it flat on her palm and said she had not turned it in and did not know what she was going to do with it and was going to be destroyed either way. Tully Hardy looked at the card and then at his watch. 32 hours had gone by. He knew, everybody who worked with dogs knew, that 32 hours is not automatically the end. He also knew what a hip wound in that heat meant, and he did the arithmetic and got an answer he did not like and went anyway. He went to Captain Fitzgerald first, and he did it properly, and he was refused, and the refusal was not cruelty. She had a live belt, a dead soldier, an amputee, an assessment of killed in action from the officer on the ground, and 2 denied requests above her. She told him no. Then she told him no a second time, slowly, while looking at him, and she wrote in her log that she had denied a request from a dog handler to conduct an unsupported search, and she noted the time, and she did not confiscate his weapon, or his dog, or restrict him to the base, and Tully Hardy understood every single thing she was not saying. He signed out a vehicle at 0240 on Sunday, with dime in the back, a marking kit, and 4 liters of water. He was, technically, committing an offense that could have ended his career and put him in confinement. He would say later that he did not think about it at all, and that is almost certainly true. And it is also the reason a young man who had been given nothing by anybody was about to become the most important person in a family he had never met. At 0340 Zulu, in a shack in Missouri, Adley Brannon heard a carrier come up on a dead frequency, and a voice she had known her whole life say 4 words she could barely make out through the noise, and she pressed the headphones against her skull with both hands and started writing. The signal was terrible. It was a 5-watt survival radio lying on its back in a valley, on a band that should not have worked, on a morning that happened to fall in a window when that band does exactly one impossible thing a day. 2 of Ella Pepper's 19 listeners heard it too, one in Missouri and one on a hillside outside Limassol, and all 3 recorded it. He gave his call sign. He gave a grid. He said the word hip and the word artery, and then a number, which was how many meters he had cleared. 31. And then Adley Brannon keyed the microphone and did the single most important thing anybody did in this entire story, which was to not panic. She read his grid back to him, digit by digit, the way she had been taught for 6 years by a man reading her numbers on Sunday mornings, and he confirmed it, and she logged it with the time in UTC. And then she said, and this exists on 3 separate recordings, which is why it survived a defense counsel's attempt to call it a child's fantasy. She said, Dad, I knew Uncle Sheridan would do this. I wrote it down in November. Stay where you are. Someone special is coming to help you. He's already driving. Ella Pepper was on the phone at the same moment, on a landline, to a duty officer at a joint operations center whose number she had gotten by calling 4 people who owed her favors, reading out a grid coordinate that a 14-year-old had just copied off a 5-watt radio. And 40 minutes away in a valley, Corporal Tulane Hardy stopped a truck at the edge of a road and opened the back, and a brindle Malinois with one ear that never stood up jumped down into the dark. Dime worked the ground for 2 hours and 11 minutes. Tully ran her the way you run a dog on an unmarked belt, in short arcs off a long line, letting her cast into the wind and pulling her back, marking every response with a white picket and going around it. She gave him 9 responses in the first hour, 9 live indications. In ground 400 people had walked in December on the strength of a certificate. He was not thinking about certificates. He was thinking about a grid a girl had read out over a radio, and the fact that the sun was coming up in 90 minutes, and that Dime could not work in the day heat, because a dog's nose is a chemical instrument, and heat destroys the vapor plume. At 0558, 94 meters from the road, the dog turned on a dime. She did not sit, which is what she did for explosive. She dropped her head and drove forward, and made a sound in her chest that Tully Hardy had never heard from her in 3 years. And he let the line run, and she went 11 meters and stopped and stood over a man lying on his back in the dirt with a fiberglass stick in his right hand. Abram Brannon was conscious, barely. His last log transmission had been 50 minutes earlier. He had cleared, in 22 hours, with a broken pelvis, 37 meters of a 90-meter lane, and he had marked every single one of them. The first thing he said, when a 23-year-old corporal skidded down beside him, was not thank God or my daughter or water. He said, my lane runs 270, don't step off it. Tully Hardy, who would tell this part badly for the rest of his life, because he could never get through it, followed a dying man's bootlace and wrapper and spent casing markers back out to the road, dragging him on a poncho, in the dark, and did not deviate from it by more than a foot. The medevac came in at 0740. They put 11 units of blood into Abram Brannon in the first 90 minutes. He woke up 9 days later in Landstuhl, in Germany, with a titanium plate holding his pelvis together and a fragment they had elected to leave in him because taking it out was more dangerous than leaving it, and the first thing he did with a functioning voice was ask for a pen. Nobody had told him anything yet. He wrote down from memory, in a hospital notebook, every detail of the 3 days he could recall, in order, with times. He was still writing when a major from the casualty office came in to explain, apologetically, that there had been an administrative complication because his wife had filed for survivor benefits on the 5th of April. He had been pulled out of the field on the 5th of April. His wife had signed a survivor benefit plan election and a life insurance claim initiation that morning, both notarized in prior landing, and the second signature block on the family assistance form, the one for the individual assisting the beneficiary, carried the name Sheridan R. Elwood, and it was dated the 4th of April. The 4th. The day before anyone knew whether Abram Brannon was alive, and 11 hours after Sheridan had told the operations officer that his brother-in-law was gone, someone had sat at a kitchen table in Missouri and started the paperwork. Adley Brannon had photographed every page of it while her mother was in the shower, because a girl who has learned that records matter does not wait to be asked. Abram Brannon came home in a wheelchair on the 2nd of June, and for the next 14 months he did almost nothing that anybody expected. The investigation went the way these things go, when there is one witness who will not speak, and one officer with a name that opens doors. Doc Callis gave a statement that was accurate about the withdrawal and silent about the pistol, because Sheridan Elwood had, in the intervening weeks, filed a counseling statement questioning her judgment under fire and quietly let her know that a board could be arranged. And Abram Brannon, to the astonishment of everyone including his own lawyer, gave a statement in which he said he had been rendered unconscious by the second detonation, could not reliably recall the platoon net, and did not wish to make an allegation he could not personally prove. The preliminary hearing officer recommended no referral to court-martial. Insufficient evidence. Lieutenant Elwood received a memorandum of concern for the loss of marking discipline in the lane, was reassigned to battalion staff, and 11 weeks later, Kestrel Clearance Group was awarded the Corridor follow-on contract worth $41 million over 3 years. His sister filed for divorce from a man in a wheelchair in September and cited the marriage's irretrievable breakdown and asked for the house and got a temporary custody order. And Abram Brannon said nothing and went to physical therapy 4 days a week and learned to walk again with a cane and a limp that would never leave, and told his daughter, in the shack, with the door shut, exactly what he was doing and why. Because the thing about Abram Brannon that his brother-in-law had never once understood was this: he was not a man who reacted, he was a man who surveyed. He had learned at 7, in a truck that smelled like wet clay, that you do not tell people what you think is under the ground. You prove it, meter by meter, and you write it down, and then when you finally speak you are not making a claim, you are reading from a book. A court-martial in June, on his word against a lieutenant's, with a terrified medic and a translated statement, was a claim. He wanted a book. So he waited, and he healed, and then he did the single most consequential thing available to a medically retired staff sergeant with 20 years of mine survey experience and a spotless technical record. He applied for a job. The Colvin Corridor's donor consortium maintained an independent acceptance body, a small, deeply unglamorous civilian office, staffed mostly by retired engineers, whose entire function was to walk contractor-proofed land before it was handed to farmers and either accept it or reject it. They were the last signature. Nothing became cleared land, legally, in that valley until one of their surveyors put a stick in it and signed. They hired Abram Brannon in March, 14 months after a lieutenant left him in a field, because he was the most qualified applicant they had ever received, and because the man who interviewed him asked why a person would want to go back there, and Abram said, "I have unfinished ground." The contract that his office had authority over was the $41 million Kestrel follow-on, and buried in that contract, in an annex that Rosalind Elwood's lawyers had signed off on years earlier because it had never once been invoked, was a clause about disputed squares. If the acceptance body found reason to question previously certified land, the contractor was required to re-demonstrate the certification, in person, with the certifying official present on the ground, walking the square, at the contractor's cost. Abram Brannon read that annex the way other men read a love letter. He filed his findings on the 8th of April, 1 year and 5 days after the 3rd of April, slowly and completely, with the receipts stapled to the back. 11 squares, 11 certificates, photographs of undisturbed soil crust from the previous year. 9 live indications logged by a military dog team inside a certified square. 2 mines recovered from the interior of Colvan 44 by an ordnance disposal team in June. Soil crust analysis from a university lab in Missouri that he had paid for himself with the last of his savings, establishing the reformation rate of that specific clay to a confidence he could defend. He did not accuse anyone of anything, not once, in 94 pages. He simply demonstrated, in the flat and unarguable language of his trade, that 11 squares had been certified as proofed by a process that could not have produced the physical evidence observed. The consortium invoked the annex on the 19th of April. The certifying official of record for all 11 squares, the man who had countersigned every one of them as the military quality assurance representative, and who was now, having resigned his commission the previous autumn, Kestrel Clearance Group's vice president for operations, was Sheridan Elwood. Kestrel could refuse. Refusing meant forfeiting the $41 million, defaulting on a bridge loan personally guaranteed by Sheridan Elwood, and triggering a debarment review that would end the company his mother had spent 40 years building. Or Sheridan Elwood could get on a plane, put on a visor and an apron and boots, and walk 11 squares of ground he personally had certified as safe. He got on the plane. The redemonstration began on the 4th of May, and it was, by design, the most ordinary thing in the world. That was the part Abram had thought hardest about. There was no ambush in it, no threat, no trick, nothing a lawyer could ever call coercion. There was only a contract clause, a protocol, and a man who had signed his name 11 times. The protocol was simple. The certifying official entered the square first, on a lane of his own establishing, with a prodder. An acceptance surveyor followed 9 meters behind him, documenting. Everything was recorded on the audit net, because everything in that valley was recorded, and the recordings went to the consortium, the contractor, and the Sarmenian ministry. The acceptance surveyor assigned to the redemonstration was Abram Brannon. He limped. That was the thing that got into Sheridan Elwood on the first morning and never came out. The man walked 9 meters behind him for 11 days with a titanium hip and a cane strapped across his back, and he never once said anything that was not procedural, and he never once looked away. On day 1, in Colvan 38, Sheridan Elwood covered 400 square meters in 6 hours, found nothing, came off the ground shaking, and told his lawyer on the phone that this was harassment. On day 3, in Colvan 41, at 9:40 in the morning, his prodder touched something at 11 centimeters, and he screamed, and did not stop screaming for some time, and it was a piece of shale. On day 4 he asked, on the open audit net, whether the acceptance body would consider a negotiated finding. Abram Brannon answered, on the net, that the acceptance body had no authority to negotiate physical facts, and read the next square's coordinates. By day 6, the man was not sleeping. He had lost 11 pounds. He had begun, in the mornings, to argue with the protocol officer about the spacing, that 2 centimeters was excessive, that the standard allowed 3, that nobody actually did 2, and every word of it was recorded, and every word of it was, to anyone who understood the trade, a confession playing at half speed. On day 8, in the middle of Colvan 44, Sheridan Elwood sat down in the dirt and would not move. He was 106 meters into a square he had certified as proofed to 13 centimeters by 9 men in a single day in December, and he was sitting in the exact wedge of ground where, 13 months earlier, a man had lain on his side and prodded his own way toward a road. Abram Brannon stopped 9 meters behind him, as the protocol required, and waited, as the protocol required. Sheridan turned around. On the recording, His voice is high and thin and very young. He said, "You know it isn't clear. You know. Nobody walked this. Nobody ever walked this. We didn't have the days. We never had the days. And I signed it, because if I didn't sign it, we lost the bond, and my mother lost everything. And I have been walking on ground I know isn't clear for 8 days, and you have been watching me do it." And then he said the sentence that a prosecutor would play 4 times to a panel of officers. "I left you here because you were going to say exactly this." There were 9 people on that audit net. There were 3 recorders running. There was a ministry observer, a consortium engineer, and a safety officer, and every one of them heard a man confess, on an open channel, to certifying uncleared land and to abandoning a wounded soldier to protect the certification. What happened next is the part that Abram Brannon still cannot tell without stopping. Because Sheridan Elwood, sitting in the dirt, having said all of it, then stood up and turned to walk out. And he did not walk out on his own lane. He was disoriented and finished, and he took 2 steps on a bearing nobody had ever proofed. The ordnance disposal team supporting the re-demonstration had a dog working the edge of the square that morning, and that dog had given a response 19 minutes earlier, 40 centimeters off the line Sheridan Elwood had just stepped onto, and it was marked with a white picket that he walked straight past because he was not looking at anything. Abram Brannon shouted his name once. And then Staff Sergeant Abram Brannon, medically retired, with a titanium pelvis, walked 9 meters onto unproofed ground and grabbed the man who had left him to die by the back of his collar and pulled him backward off it, and both of them went down hard in the dirt, and the ordnance team recovered a live blast mine from that position 4 hours later, 31 centimeters from where Sheridan Elwood's boot had been. Sheridan lay on his back and wept and asked him why. And Abram Brannon, breathing like a man with a broken hip who has just done something stupid, said the only thing he had left to say to him, which was, "Because I don't sign for ground I haven't walked." Then he stood up and got his cane and read the next square's coordinates. Everything after that was just paperwork, and paperwork was the one weapon Abram Brannon had never had to borrow. The confession on the audit net reopened the criminal case within 9 days, and when Army investigators came back a second time, they came back with a recording of a man saying, "I left you here," and that changed the physics of the room. Sergeant Ondine Callis, who had carried a small plastic card in a sock drawer for 14 months and had not slept properly in any of them, turned it in on a Tuesday morning to a special agent named Cambry Wickham, and then sat in a parking lot and shook for an hour. The footage was 109 minutes long. 40 seconds of it mattered. On those 40 seconds, a lieutenant tells a medic that his sister will get the pension and the kids, threatens her career, and draws a sidearm to stop her reaching a man with a severed artery. Abram Brannon had never asked her for it, not once in 14 months. His lawyer thought that was a tactical decision. It was not. He had simply decided he was not going to be one more person in that woman's life telling her what she owed. The court-martial ran 11 days in the following spring. Abram Brannon testified on the 4th day. She was 16 by then. She brought 2 logbooks and a folder, and the trial counsel, a captain named Rosabelle Ainsworth, walked her through it slowly, and the defense objected 11 times to a teenager's notebook and lost every time, because a contemporaneous log kept in the ordinary course of a licensed operator's activity is a category of evidence courts have understood for 100 years. She read the entry from the 23rd of November, 2241 local, in which her uncle said that nobody walks that ground anyway. She read grid coordinates and certificate numbers logged in March, a month before the incident, in a child's handwriting, time-stamped and witnessed by 19 operators in 11 time zones who had all, because a retired air traffic controller had trained them to, kept their own copies. And she read the last entry, from 0340 Zulu on the 5th of April, which said, "Dad alive, grid copied twice, told him help coming, help is Tully." The panel deliberated for 6 hours. Sheridan Elwood was convicted of attempted murder, dereliction of duty resulting in death, and conspiracy to defraud the United States, and sentenced to 22 years in confinement, total forfeiture of pay, and a dismissal from the service. The fraud counts were the ones that took the family down with him. Kestrel Clearance Group was debarred from federal contracting. The $41 million award was voided. The bridge loan came due against a personal guarantee, and Rosalind Elwood, 65 years old in the same brown coat, was indicted separately for false claims and pled to a term she is still serving. Marielle Brannon's lawyer withdrew the custody petition 11 days after the survivor benefit filing entered the record, because there is no argument in the world for a mother who signed a life insurance claim on a man who was, at that hour, alive in a field clearing his own lane with a stick. She was not charged. She lost everything else. Adley chose her father in a judge's chambers, in a conversation that lasted 4 minutes, and the two of them drove home and did not talk about it, and stopped for pie. Sergeant Ondine Callis received a soldier's medal, which she keeps in a drawer. She left the army the following year, works as a paramedic in Bakersfield, and calls Abram Brannon on the 3rd of April every year, and neither of them ever says much. Tulane Hardy was recommended for punishment for the unauthorized movement, and instead received the soldier's medal as well, on the recommendation of a company commander named Sabina Fitzgerald, who had denied his request twice, slowly, while looking at him. He drove to Pryor Landing, Missouri, at the end of his enlistment for what he said would be a week, in a truck with a retired Belgian Malinois in the passenger seat. He has a room over the garage there now and a job with a well-drilling outfit, and he does not sign his letters the guy with the dog anymore, because he does not need to write letters. Dime died at 11, on a porch, in the sun, with a 16-year-old girl's hand on her ribs. And Abram Brannon walks with a cane down lanes he proofs himself, 4 days a week, for a small, unglamorous office that gives farmers their fields back, and every night he writes in a green sewn-binding notebook what he did, and where, and how deep, and on the shelf beside those 11 books, there are now 9 more that belong to his daughter, whose call sign is painted on the door of a shack 3 houses down, under an older one that has a black line through it and a date. I have been sitting with this one for a while, and the thing that will not leave me alone is not the field. It is the November hallway. A 14-year-old girl heard 11 seconds of a phone call and wrote it down, and 11 months later that scrap of a sentence, "Nobody walks that ground anyway," was the load-bearing wall of a federal fraud case. She did not know what she had. That is the whole point. She could not have known. She wrote it down because a man who dug wells for a living taught his grandson, who taught his daughter, that the log is not for today. The log is for the version of you that will need it later and will not be able to remember. Here is what I actually want you to take out of this, and it is not about minefields. Watch for the person who starts organizing your paperwork before anybody asks them to. Sheridan Elwood did not begin his betrayal in that valley. He began it at a kitchen table, being helpful, in a family that was grateful for the help. The forms came first. The forms always come first, and they come wrapped in kindness, and the person handing them to you is usually the only one in the room who has read them. If somebody is unusually eager to hold the pen on your behalf, for a parent, for a spouse, for a business, that is not generosity. That is positioning. Ask to see the second signature block. Ask what the date says. And the other one, the big one, the stick. Every important claim in your life is either proofed or certified, and those are not the same word. Certified means somebody signed. Proofed means somebody went and looked, meter by meter, and can show you the book. A diagnosis, a title deed, an inspection, a background check, a promise from a man who remembers the name of your dog. Ask which one you are holding. Most of the disasters people walk into are not unmarked ground. They are marked ground that nobody actually walked. Abram Brannon survived because he refused, even bleeding out, even alone, to leave an unmarked lane behind him. So here is my question for you tonight, and I genuinely want it in the comments. What are you currently standing on because somebody told you it was clear? Go look at one of those this week. Just one. Put the stick in.